Object-oriented programming is one of the most popular programming paradigms used around the world. Therefore, it's vital to know this if you're trying to land a job. Let's see what problems it solves for us. Imagine you have 500 employees that you're trying to keep track of. What you might do is have separate variables for each and every employee. So you might have something like employee 1 name equals that, and employee 2 might be Bob. But this leads to a lot of issues. You have to write out the variables for every single employee. You might try to work with lists maybe and have like a list of all the employees which stores all of the names inside of it. But this might be hard to keep track of as well. What's a lot easier to do in object-oriented programming is we might actually have an object that describes the employee, and then we just instantiate that object for every employee. That way, it's a lot easier to keep track of. So let's see what it might look like. You define an object by starting out with the keyword class, and then you give it a name. Usually starts out with a capital letter, as that's the convention. We can then define all of the different variables that might describe an employee inside of the init class. This is a very special type of class, which you might be familiar with if you're coming from other languages, which might be known as a constructor. So in here, the first keyword that we always have to pass in is self, and the self will refer to the instance of the class. This is going to become a little clearer later on. Then we will pass all of the arguments that we want to be special to this employee. So we might have something like first name, last name, and then we want to store this for each instance of the employee. So we use the instance variable, and then we can say the first name. This can be any variable that you want. This would be the equivalent of defining the first name and the global scope, but in this case, this is going to be scoped only to this employee, and we'll just write out quickly all of the other names. Okay, and now if we instantiate this class, which we do by saying employee, just give a variable any name that you want, like you usually would, and then we use the employee class from above over here, and we give it the first name, the last name, and the pay, okay? And we can instantiate as many of these as we want. So no longer do we have to write out a variable special for the first name, the last name, the pay. Instead, we've got it all grouped together nicely in an object. So now that we've got instances of all the employees, we might want to do something a little bit more interesting with them. We might want to, for example, print out their full name. So we might define a function that looks something like this. But you can see that we already get warnings coming from VS Code because we forgot to pass the self keyword inside of it. Now, why exactly do we need self? Well, each class has to refer to itself in some way, because if we did not have this, then there would be no way for Python to know which instance we actually are referring to, whether it's employee 4 or employee 1. So we have to pass in the self argument, and then when we call a method, Python will know exactly which instance it refers to, so it prints out the full name for the right employee. So let's say I want to print out the full name of the first employee. So I'm going to say print employee1 dot print full name, and now when I run it, we can see that I get the full name correctly. So you might find that this is a little bit weird because we didn't actually pass in any arguments into the function, but it seems like it's expecting the self argument inside of it. So what's actually going on? Well, behind the scenes, Python actually will translate this into something which looks like this. We call this employee class and the print full name inside of it, and then as the instance of the class, we pass in employee 1. So these two lines are actually equivalent to each other, but this is just a little bit more readable, so that's why we use this instead of this. Let's talk a little bit more about this init class. So why do we have these two underscores in front of the init and then after it? In Python, we call these dunder, and these are special classes defined by Python. There are quite a few that actually exist, but this init class, this init function, will run every time that an instance is created. So whenever we go to this line and call employee with the variable inside of it, it will call this init class with the variables that we passed in, setting all of these class variables so that we have them ready to go whenever we want to print out the full name or do anything else with that instance of the class. So there's a lot more to cover with classes, so make sure to smash that like button, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.